This gaming PC escaped my shop because the second you go to turn the system on, it'll act like it's firing up just like normal, with all the fans kicking on. But what's not normal about this system is that you'll never get a display out to your screen. Like, you could let this system sit all day and nothing would ever show up on the monitor. So what exactly is going on here? Well, anytime you have a PC that turns on just like this, but you end up getting no display out, it's usually a perfect example of a system failing the power on self-test. That your computer's motherboard runs on every single startup the second you press the power button, where it checks the health and compatibility of all your internal hardware, like your CPU, GPU, RAM, and storage device, to ensure you have a smooth user operation with your PC. However, if one of your components doesn't pass the power on self-test because of a health or compatibility reason, it'll actually stop the startup process, which prevents the system from getting a display out, just like what we're seeing here, letting us know something's up. So what's causing this system to not post? Well, anytime I have a PC that's clearly failed the power on self-test with no display out despite the system turning on, the first thing I'm always looking for are any kind of onboard diagnostic LEDs like these in the top right of the motherboard. Because if you didn't know, on most boards these days, you'll typically find built-in diagnostic LEDs or easy debug LEDs depending on the motherboard manufacturer you have. They're called a couple different things. QLEDs, I believe, on Asus as well. But they do all the exact same thing. They're typically labeled CPU, DRAM, VGA, and boot, which happen to be the four main components tested during the power on self-test. And what they do is they light up in sequence when you first turn your system on, typically, to go ahead and light up each component when it gets tested. This way, when one of them happens to fail, it typically will hang on the LED that's stuck of the faulty component, which doesn't actually happen to be the case with us, because if we look closely, it's actually cycling between two different LEDs, which if we punch in just a little bit closer, we'll see that it's actually cycling between the CPU and DRAM over and over and over again. So what does something like that mean? Well, to find out, we first got to hear a quick word from today's sponsor, Thunder Robot, and their 016 Pro gaming laptop, who I've personally been a big fan of because they take laptop cooling more serious than just about any brand out there, with its 7 high-efficiency heat pipe design that happen to be tied to not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 dedicated heat sinks, which get cooled by 2 massive blower-style fans for maximum heat dissipation for the Intel Core Ultra 9 275HX and RTX 5070 Ti, which happen to be responsible for driving a crazy 16-inch QHD plus 360Hz IPS display. And if you're curious, yes, this model is fully upgradable with 2 M.2 NVMe slots and 2 SODIMM slots, allowing you to double your RAM or even quadruple your storage easily, making for the ultimate portable workstation and gaming PC in one, which you might want to pick up right now because the current deals on Thunder Robot laptops are pretty sweet, and a huge thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. So let's get back to the repair. So what's causing these diagnostic LEDs to go back and forth like this and not hang on the component that's faulty? Well, I typically see this in a few different circumstances. Probably the most common is that the PC is actually restarting itself, either because of the faulty component, overheating, or maybe a lack of power. But I don't believe that's the case here. A lot of times when that's the case, it'll go from one LED to the second or third LED, and then what it will do is stay there for a couple seconds and then restart back to the first. You also usually see the LEDs turn off on the rest of the components, as well as the fans will often restart themselves as well, or at least slow down temporarily. But none of that seems to be going on here. The other thing that can cause this same behavior, especially when you're going between a CPU and DRAM LED back and forth over and over again, well, that's usually because of an issue with like the memory training process, often associated with the memory controller on the CPU itself. That usually will cause the CPU to not be able to properly communicate with the RAM, not detect it properly, and is sometimes what will cause these type of behaviors. But I don't even think we're getting that far. I think we're actually before the power on self-test really kicks on, just because I noticed a couple other weird things with the motherboard. The first and probably most important is there should be what's called a digi-debug LED. It's an alphanumeric character on higher end boards you'll typically see. It'll have like A1 or B2, whatever, a bunch of different codes. And those codes usually signify what's going on. It gives you a little more further information. It's usually right underneath the diagnostic LEDs, and they basically give you a little more detail on like, okay, what's wrong here? Is it more of a memory controller issue? Do we have missing RAM? Like, it'll give you more detail than just a simple LED, which can be great for diagnostics. But on this motherboard, it's off, which is really, really weird because that usually kicks on the second you press power. So I think the issue is that we're failing super early on. And the other thing I noticed is that all of these fans happen to be wired up for RGB, yet none of them have it, which is a little weird as well, which is why I believe the issue is really early. So the only early components that could cause the system to feel like it's not even getting that far to the point where it's actually really testing the RAM would be a faulty CPU or an issue with the motherboard. And when it comes to the CPU motherboard, one thing I noticed that was a little weird with the system is those aren't screws at all to go ahead and hold down the CPU cooler. As I'm quite familiar with the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, I've used it a ton, and those are supposed to be thumb screws when these look to be mounts for a back plate instead. So let's get these guys all pulled out so we can pull off the cooler, as what I'm most suspicious of causing this type of weird behavior is either the CPU, which appears to be a Ryzen 7 7800X3D, or possible damage because of the wrong mounting screws, which could have caused damage to the socket. And if you're wondering why I'm unscrewing this bracket right here, well, we actually wouldn't be able to release the CPU unless we just slide that down, as we wouldn't be able to release the retention mechanism that holds in our CPU. And the reason I wanted to pull this out is because I wanted to check the socket pins, which look all right. As sometimes damaged pins on the CPU socket can cause your system to act like it has a bad CPU, but because the socket looks perfectly fine, I'm pretty certain that this issue is CPU related. But to know for sure, we're gonna toss in a spare CPU, so let's go ahead and drop that in to the perfectly functioning socket, close down the retention mechanism, and lock down our CPU. Then, although I wouldn't recommend you do this unless you're gonna be very careful, I'm gonna toss on the cooler without any thermal paste or any thumb screws, because I want to just do a temporary boot where I turn on the power supply before firing the system up. This way I can just see if things look different. And I can tell already, we definitely have something different. We got our digital debug LED turning on 1A, and it's cycling through. And guess what? Those diagnostic LEDs that were cycling between CPU and DRAM are no longer cycling at all. And also, check that out. All the RGB that wasn't working is back to life. And if we give the system a second, it looks like we finally passed the power on self-test, getting a display out. Meaning more likely than not, our customers got a faulty Ryzen 7 7800X3D. But we can confirm this by shutting the PC back off and swapping my testing CPU back over to our customer's original, just to confirm that it wasn't something like the CPU not seated properly, which can sometimes cause that same kind of behavior. But in our case, with our customer's CPU back in, if we turn on our power supply and fire the system up, we should see, yeah, we're back to the exact same issue. No digital debug LED and cycling between the CPU and DRAM diagnostic LED over and over again, proving we got ourselves a faulty 7800X3D. And that actually makes a lot more sense why we were seeing the issue that we were seeing. See, with a CPU that's fried or is failing or is starting to go out, what can happen is because the power on self-test tests the CPU first, before anything else, if it doesn't detect the CPU to even start the test, what can happen is, well, in our case, nothing was actually kicking on. And what I think was happening, it was just giving that error to let us know something was wrong with the CPU, but that was why we were seeing things like the RGB not kick on, which should have started during that power on self-test, and the things like the diagnostic LED, the digital diagnostic LED to be more specific, that one should have kicked on too, but because the CPU was fried, it never could even start up that process on the motherboard, which is why we only got those normal diagnostic LEDs on the top right. Fortunately for our customer, when it comes to a CPU, most CPUs have a 3-year warranty, which means that we could get the CPU RMA'd, which is a return merchandise authorization, which basically allows you to get a replacement CPU under warranty and no cost to you whatsoever. And our customer is going to go ahead and get this RMA'd, but in the meantime, while they wait for that, they wanted us to go ahead and put in a brand new Ryzen 7 9850X3D. That's the latest X3D CPU because they wanted a little bit of an upgrade, and then they're just going to either give this to a friend or maybe sell it down the road, as RMAs sometimes can take a couple weeks and they really can't be down without their system for that long. And component failure is always a perfect time to upgrade, so let's get this installed in our customer's motherboard before adding back the mounting bracket, which remember we had to go ahead and slide down so that we could undo the retention mechanism, before adding some thermal paste and slotting our cooler into place. Which, trust me, we're not going to use these old screws again that our customer was using to go ahead and hold it down. Rather, because I hoard a lot of old mounting hardware and old coolers, I was actually able to find an old Arctic liquid freezer too that I can actually take the mounting hardware of, at least temporarily, so that our customer can have a proper mount. And I'll just go ahead and order some from my contact at Arctic so I don't have to worry about it in the future if I ever want to use this old cooler again. It is kind of interesting though that the old ones did technically work and they have the same threading, but it's definitely not what the cooler was designed for. So let's go ahead and get all 4 of these into place, going in a cross pattern. This way we spread the thermal paste nice and even and don't have to worry about uneven pressure. And these old ones our customer were using was a pain to pull out because there was actually no screw head. So you had to basically unscrew them manually by putting your fingers on the side. That kind of cuts your fingers up a little bit. So I'm glad we got real screws there, especially for serviceability long term. So with the old fried CPU out, the new CPU in, with the cooler now mounted properly, let's go ahead and get this system fired up. But we should see that, check that out, just like before with the other CPU, we are now seeing that we're no longer cycling between the CPU and DRAM LEDs, and that diagnostic LED, the digital one, is turning right on. Plus, just like before, the RGB on all the fans kicked on, and we post. And more importantly, boot all the way into Windows without a problem, thanks to us having this fried Ryzen 7 7800 X3D out of the system that was causing the system to basically stop the entire power on self-test process, which is why it was repeating that CPU and DRAM LED over and over again. So I'm glad this is swapped out with a brand new Ryzen 7 9850X 3D, which is a nice little bit of a performance upgrade, while our customers still can RMA the CPU because it still is under warranty. But getting the system back today allows our customer to have it working in the meantime, and then they can sell this off later once they get their replacement, or maybe use it for another system. So if you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure you give it a like, subscribe for more content like this, and let me know in the comments that you guys want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you guys in the next one.